Woo! Despite making a half-hour video review for Armored Core 6, I still feel like I have so much more to say about the game. And I'm specifically referring to the boss fights. And it's no surprise, but From Software is iconic for their phenomenal boss fights. And it was a huge reason why me and so many fans got interested in playing the game. But one of the downsides for making a huge review is that I had to cover pretty much every aspect about the gameplay, and was only able to briefly touch upon the boss fights. In this video, I'm going to be giving the boss fights in this game their proper due and respect. I'm going to be analyzing them and reviewing them in complete totality. I won't be covering most Armored Core on Armored Core fights in this game for the sole reason that the gameplay is pretty similar across the board. You're essentially dealing with a PvP build with extended health values, and there's only so much I have to say about those fights. With that being said, let's get started with the video. I'm going to keep the marketing to a minimum. Please like, comment, and subscribe. This channel is growing, and it's all thanks to you guys. With that being said, let's get started. And up first, we have the PCA attack helicopter. And despite being a tutorial boss and objectively the easiest fight in the game, a lot of players consider it the first real filter. And for those that don't know, a video game filter is a slang terminology for a difficulty spike that can take the form in a boss fight or a level for the sole purpose of communicating to the player core gameplay concepts that they're going to need to understand if they want to finish the game. For new players, the filter is less the actual boss fight, but just getting used to the controls of the game. Armored Cores don't control like most humanoid third-person protagonists. They're giant robots that move by skating along the floor, propelled by boosters. There's a momentum that the player is going to have to get used to. You can also fly and fight around in 3 dimensions, and this can take some getting used to if you're used to stop and pop third-person gameplay. I would say this boss fight succeeds at being a good filter because it's not really challenging as long as you understand the core mechanics of the game. The helicopter will sit in the air shooting missiles at the player, and to dodge those missiles, the player is going to have to get used to the physics and momentum-based movement options. You also have to keep in mind that this is one of the few times in the game the player is given a default loadout, and the most powerful weapon in that loadout is a close-range melee weapon that if you want to use on the boss, you're going to have to fly in the air and take this fight in 3 dimensions. I still remember the first time I played this game, I died a few times on this boss fight. I wasn't quite used to the physics and momentum. It was a little different than the last Armored Core game I played, but as soon as it clicked in my head, I instantly destroyed the boss fight, which is pretty unique because normally there'll be a gradual progression where I slowly get closer and closer to defeating the boss fight, but in this case, I went from instantly dying to instantly killing this boss fight over a few seconds, and that's pretty unique. And that just goes to show you that the boss completely succeeds at being a good filter. Once you understand the core mechanics, he's trivial, and you're going to need those mechanics for the rest of the game. It's no surprise that you only unlock the call sign Raven after you can beat the helicopter. The first half of the Juggernaut fight is a bit of a set piece where the player is placed in a clear advantage. You're allied with Rusty, who is one of the best mech pilots in the game. And the gimmick for this fight is pretty simple to understand. The weakness for the Juggernaut is behind it. You need to attack it while Rusty distracts it. And this makes the first phase of the fight pretty trivial, but during the second phase, Rusty won't be available and the player will be left on their own. And this will be the first point in the game where the player's build gets put into question. The Juggernaut has a lot of aerial of denial effects where he will make the floor unusable, and he charges the player pretty quickly. This will put the player's build into question for the first time. They'll need to be able to get into the air and have enough mobility options to get behind the mech to deal decent damage. Again, this is still a fairly simple boss fight, and at this point From Software is just raising some small problems for the player to solve. You can still get by without using a specialized build, but I still appreciate it for asking questions to the player. And now we have debatably the most controversial boss fight in the game, the Bringer of Salt, Balteus. And Balteus is widely considered Armored Core 6's biggest filter in the game, but the debate has been pretty split in the community. When Armored Core 6 first came out, a lot of people thought he was so challenging that From Software actually released an update patch that made the boss easier, but After some time has passed, the community seems to think that he's actually a fair fight. I'm of the opinion that Balteus is a really good boss fight, but suffers from bad pacing. You see, on repeat playthroughs, once the player properly understands the mechanics, he's actually pretty easy and a lot of fun to fight. But during your first time playing the game, I believe he overshoots his job as a filter by a wide margin. The point of Balteus, his job as a filter, is to convey the premise to the player that they should be spending most of their time in the garage creating specialized builds. And he does that by raising a lot of questions to the player. How do you get through the pulse shield? Do you have the right weaponry to deal the right damage? What about his Etano Circus missile volley? Are you able to dodge this to deal decent damage? Balteus has incredible mobility. He can bolt from one side of the stage to the other. Do you have the mobility options to stay in range and deal the most damage? And what about his second form, where he pulls fire swords out of his ass and can delete your health bar in seconds? How do you deal with that problem? And don't forget the fact that during your first run of the game, your parts will be severely limited and your mech won't be as upgraded. But my main issue here isn't that the boss is difficult. As a matter of fact, I would argue that in order for a boss to successfully function as a filter, it needs to be hard. My main issue is that, what is it even filtering? The next 4 boss fights in the game are trivial by comparison. The Smart Cleaner, the Sea Spider, the Cataphract, and the Ice Worm are a joke in comparison. The issue here is pacing. If you're going to give me a boss fight this hard early on, the guys after him better pose a bit of a challenge. It's only in the late game that we really encounter boss fights that reach this level of a challenge. Up next, we have the Smart Cleaner, and I just want to point out that this boss is hilariously simple, especially coming off a hard-fought battle with Balteus. The key to this fight is to have an armored core that can balance between both staying airborne and ground-based combat, respectively. The Smart Cleaner has melee attacks that are best avoided by jumping in the air and staying out of range. You don't have iframes here, so it's a lot more efficient to just stay airborne. He also has a weak point that is completely vulnerable during the first phase of the fight, so you're pretty much incentivized to stay in the air as much as humanly possible. During the second phase of the fight, the Smart Cleaner will start using area of denial attacks both in the sky and on the ground. He will literally make the floor lava, and if you stay in the air too long, his weak point that at one point was defenseless will start erupting like a volcano. The player will need to balance between both staying in the air and on the ground, depending on what type of area of denial the Smart Cleaner is currently using. While I would consider this the most generic and default of From Software bosses in the game, I do appreciate the fact that it was designed to teach the player to manage their spacing and to balance between ground-based and aerial-based combat. And up next, we have the Sea Spider, and I just want to say that this guy reminds me of the security robot from Metroid Fusion. Both boss fights are spider-based, and they gank the player right out of nowhere. And at this point in the game, the Spider is the most aggressive boss fight the player will face. The Sea Spider will bull rush the player out of nowhere with aggressive melee attacks. And if that doesn't work, he'll shoot a giant laser at you when you're right out of range. The Sea Spider is really a fair challenge. He'll be on your ass from start to finish, and he'll test your ability to dodge without using iframes. You'll be quick boosting so much, you'll run out of meter. The boss also has an alternate form. I wouldn't really consider it a second phase because he kind of shifts between the two phases intermittently, where he'll fly into the air and hit the player with ranged attacks. If you've run out of boost meter from his first and more aggressive form, this is a good opportunity to land some decent hits in. All in all, I would say that this is a really good boss fight. But for pacing issues, I think that if the Sea Spider and Balteus switch spots in the game, that would be a lot more fair and balanced for the player and would make a lot more sense to me. And up next is the PCA Cataphract. And the Cataphract is a lightning-fast tank on the ground that will try to ram the player at high speeds and then blast you with a laser cannon while doing a donut in the ground. The Cataphract is essentially a reverse Juggernaut. Its weakness is in front of it and underneath it. And this is the first point in the game where the player will be given no clear advantage by staying airborne. And since its weakness is narrow and hard to hit, and since it's the most dangerous part of the boss where you're likely to take damage, the player is incentivized to use tank treads. Tank treads allow the player to keep up with the Cataphract's lightning fast pace and also take the damage necessary to land some hits in of their own. This boss fight is essentially From Software nudging the player and saying, hey, if you haven't used tank treads on your first playthrough, you should probably be giving them a shot now. Okay, so before I start breaking down the gameplay mechanics for the Ice Worm, I want to talk a little bit about the lore here. During my review of Armored Core 6, I noticed that there was a direct parallel between the coral and the spice melange from Doom. Both are an oil-like resource that are the key to human evolution and advancement. And I kind of pat myself on the back for noticing that, like, oh, look at me, I'm a literary genius. But somehow, some way, I didn't notice the fact that Armored Core 6 has a literal sandworm in the game that functions the exact same way in Dune, and I have no idea how this went completely over my head. Like, From Software were not even trying to hide this. It's called an ice worm. It's powered by coral, the same magical MacGuffin-like substance, and narratively speaking, it's this universe's version of a dragon, a literary trope to show the player or main character overcoming a significant struggle or hurdle. The Ice Worm is this game's version of a set piece, and I'm not going to lie to you guys, it's a bit of a bummer. The most interesting thing about the fight is the lore and the in-game dialogue between Michigan and Rusty. This is the one boss fight in the game that I dread facing on every playthrough, and not because the Ice Worm is difficult or gives the player a decent challenge, but because of how boring it is. Like, the only times I take damage are when I start nodding off and stop paying attention, and then I get ganked out of nowhere. The fight itself is pretty easy and self-explanatory. Stay vigilant, wait your turn for the Ice Worm to pop in the air, and hit him in the weak point. You're playing a waiting game. There's not much strategy here. Deal massive damage. All right, please don't napalm strike me for saying this, but I'm pretty sure that the Enforcer is a Dark Souls reference. You know, there's always been a very subtle amount of crossovers between the two different franchises. Like, Patches originally started out as an Armored Core character, but ever since he was referenced in Demon Souls, he's been a franchise in Soulsborne ever since. The Enforcer looks like an homage to the giant knight with a shield and sword archetype that you commonly fight in the Dark Souls series. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that the Enforcer has a thrusting finishing move that looks like it was borderline plagiarized from the Penetrator. Like, I love the way that this knight will stab the player through the chest and then throw them into orbit. It's just an awesome killing move. However, it should be noted that the Enforcer isn't just a knight with a shield, it's a mech with plenty more tricks up its sleeve. And just for context, that this is a very fast-paced and frantic fight that takes place in a small arena. At a mid to close range, the Enforcer won't just hit you with his melee attacks, he'll shoot you with his plasma spread gun. If you stay far away, he has a giant charge-up laser attack that has a tricky timing that the player will have to get used to when they want to dodge. During the second phase of the fight, the Enforcer has a new attack where he will electrocute the floor, taking it out of play for a few seconds. While that's happening, he tries to hit the player with his most powerful melee attacks in the game. I love this fight, and I think this is the first boss fight that actually surpasses Balteus in sheer terms of raw difficulty. In terms of strategy for defeating the Enforcer, I personally believe that it's more advantageous to use a lightweight frame in this fight. You're going to want good mobility options because there's nowhere that's actually safe. You're staying on the ground could get you electrocuted, and you definitely want to avoid those fast-paced melee attacks. IB-01 Cell 240, or as it's more commonly referred to as the IBIS Mech, is one of my favorite boss fights in this game. I just love the setup here. Reach the Coral Convergence is one of the best missions in this game. And what can I say? I just love the concept of ancient cities that have more advanced technology than what we're currently capable of. Narratively speaking, it just goes to show you that this world is in a constant state of decline. It just makes the prospect of actually fighting the IBIS Mech all the more threatening since the player is at a technological disadvantage here. From a gameplay perspective, the IBIS Mech looks like he came from a completely different genre of mecha. Like, the IBIS Mech dances around the sky like he dropped right out of Zone of the Enders or Armored Core for Answer. His speed and power output is insane and awe-inspiring. You know, despite the fact that the IBIS Mech is one of the harder fights in the game, especially on your first run, From Software left it fairly open-ended with the amount of different ways you can defeat him. The easiest way, or as I like to call it, the coward's way out, is to use a heavyweight build. Cell 240 is weak to staggering, and so you could just tank shots and kill him with stun needles. But my favorite methodology is to fight the IBIS Mech on equal footing using a lightweight build. Lightweight builds can keep up with the IBIS Mech's speed and deal damage on equal footing, and it just feels better when you defeat him that way. On a side note, I love how this guy is like an amalgamation of the Cubely Mech from Gundam and the animalistic mass-produced EVA units from End of Evangelion. The next two boss fights are two late-game one-on-one AC fights that I thought were special enough to make it on this list. And up first is Rusty in his Steel Haze Ortis. So I just want to get this out of the way. Rusty in his Steel Haze Ortis is not a difficult boss fight by any stretch of the imagination. And a matter of fact, it's very easy, but the whole setup for this fight is From Software giving the player a wink in the nudge to fight this like it's in some kind of anime. It also helps that in this stage, the player has unlimited boost meter, meaning you're incentivized to dance around the sky and fight like you're playing Armored Core for answer. You don't want to fight this guy with an overpowered build, you want to fight him with a fun build. That's the entire point of this set piece. The next AC fight is actually a final boss, and that's Handler Walter. It is HAL 826 IBIS series mech suit. Gameplay-wise, on your first run of the game, I found that Walter was significantly more challenging than Rusty. That's mainly because he's using late-game weapons that do plenty of damage. So if you make a mistake, you're going to be punished for it. But the real reason why I'm talking about this fight is all the story and lore reasons. Like, it's a surprise to be even fighting Walter at this point in the game. The player doesn't even know that Walter's alive, and it's even more shocking to see him in a berserker state, being one of the best mech pilots out there. And what's tragic about it all is that even though he's in this berserker state, he lets it all out that he actually loved and cared about the player character and wanted you to find your own freedom all along, and it's a complete tragedy to even be fighting him. And up next, we have one of the three final bosses of the game, Ayre in her Soul 644 mech suit. At this point in the game, Ayre has gone full Psycho X on the player. This isn't like my vague interpretation of events. That's just what happened. She's got quotes where she's literally talking about having a shared resolve with a mech she specifically picked out for the player, or symbiosis with Coral. I mean, it's pretty evident that she's mad that we decided to burn down the ship. What I love about Ayre is that she's essentially a more difficult version of the IBIS boss fight. She has less weaknesses to exploit. If you want to easily stagger her, you're going to have to get through her pulse shield. She has melee attacks, meaning she isn't easy at a mid to close range. And on top of that, she also has a huge power output. Overall, I say it's suitable considering she's supposed to be the final boss fight of this playthrough. And now for the final boss fight, which is suitable since it's only available after you've beaten New Game Plus, Allmind possessed by Iguazu. And my first thoughts about Iguazu being the true final boss of Armored Core 6 can be best summarized in this clip.
Who the that guy?
So who the hell is Iguazu? Iguazu suffers from a massive inferiority complex. He has a one-sided rivalry with the player character that never bears fruition. At no point, whenever you fight him, does he ever offer any semblance of a challenge, and he knows it. He festers about it, and it drives the man insane. I mean, think about it. You're both 4th gen pilots, but while he suffers and fails from being a 4th gen, you succeed. You climb the ranks, you become number 1, you gain respect from everybody, and you become the most powerful mecha pilot in the game, while he sits there in the gutter being a loser. This man was so salty that even after death, his consciousness overpowered the Allmind system, and he became the true final boss of Armored Core 6. It's hilarious, and I just love this underlying meta-narrative. So this fight can be broken up into 3 different phases. The first phase, he pilots a regular Armored Core unit, but he tries to gank you with 6 other mechs. It's pretty not notable. I mean, narratively speaking, it's kind of hilarious that he's just accepted the fact that he'll never beat you in a one-on-one fight, so he has to resort to these types of tactics. During the second phase of the fight, Iguazu takes control of the Soul 644 mech that Ayre was using in the previous ending, while also having backup in the form of 2 sea spiders in their flight mode. Thankfully, Ayre hasn't gone full Psycho X on us and is here to back us up for this point of the fight. Phase 2 is a lot easier than it looks like. Despite the fact that you're getting ganked by 2 sea spiders, they're a lot easier in their flight mode, and Ayre does a lot of the work to fight them while you can focus on taking on Allmind. Iguazu does pilot the Soul 644 mech a bit differently than Ayre. He has new melee attacks, and he fights just subtly differently, which is kind of important because Other than that, it's mostly a reskin of what you already did before it. And the third phase of the fight is just a one-on-one matchup where the player faces Iguazu with no backup on both sides. And that's the final boss of the game. Woo! This video took a lot longer than I intended. This was just meant to be a nice piece of side content while I work on a new project. But if you're still here, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me who your favorite boss fight is, or more accurately, tell me what your most hated boss fight in Armored Core 6 is. Other than that, have a good one, and hopefully my next video will be better than my last video.